a story around these immigration officers who had this moral compass that they wanted to execute. Talk about your inspiration in writing the script and what you wanted audiences to come away from after seeing this film.
Well, I had to write the script. It was kind of a little restrictive in that I had to write it for these actors, and because it was commissioned by Pace University, so I had to write it for the Pace students. And in talking to the Pace students, a couple of them in the film were facing kind of immigration issues once they graduated. And so two of them had to leave the country once they graduated because they weren't able to get papers to stay. So at the time, they were very nervous about it. And so they were talking a lot about immigration. And I thought, well, why didn't I write let's address that as a writer, but also let's kind of create an immigration heist for them to do as students. And so that's kind of where the idea came from.
And then I was just telling you backstage that I realized only on re-screening for this panel that you were starring in the film, or performing in the film. And I also would just, for any film interested people in the audience, have you talk to us a little bit about the logistics. The film looks amazing. I'm sure you had a very small budget. Talk about how you were able to get what we saw on screen and how you wound up on screen.
It didn't have any money because short films don't have a lot of money, but Pace University was supplying some support. And so although I'm not a Pace University student or student filmmaker, I had to use student crew. And so part of it was training the student crew to also work on the film. And so that was difficult. And then we also had very restrictive days, meaning we only had 3 days, but they weren't full days. It was like 1 full day and then 2 evenings to kind of shoot this. So we paid a lot of attention to pre-production and kind of teaching the students that were going to be crew members on the film what pre-production meant. And the amount of work that goes into pre-production can help and save you when you don't have money or you don't have time to be able to create something that looks really good.
And how you wound up?
Oh, I wound up, the actress called in sick. She was a student. So I think she maybe thought we could just shoot it another day, but you have equipment rentals and everything that have to go back. And so no, we couldn't. So I ended up having to just play the part of the woman, and I couldn't remember my own lines, which was shameful. Because I wrote them.
All right, and then Angela, your work as a journalist, you are stationed at the border between Mexico and Texas in your beat, in your journalistic beat. Talk about what you have been exposed to in terms of the stories that the undocumented are facing, and what you've been seeing in the stories that you're covering.
Yeah, well, thank you, Opal, and I want to start by first, muchas gracias al embajador Carlos González Gutiérrez y Casa México por este gran espacio tan hermoso y estas pláticas tan interesantes. So thank you to Casa México. This is a beautiful space, and I'm really honored to be on this panel. Fascinating subjects. I am arriving just from the U.S.-Mexico border, where, of course, we all know nothing's happening these days. Yeah, it's been nonstop. I've been covering kind of the evolution of the story, the large number of Central American migrant families arriving, asking for asylum, the construction of the border wall, the fight over the funding, and of course the national emergency that we're under. So lots to cover. One of the more painful stories the last year has been the family separation issue, and we saw some of that highlighted in that wonderful film, Right at the Border Fence. That continues to be an issue, and I think that the way we kind of all dovetail nicely is in that visual storytelling. I think journalists are able to document and bear witness to what's happening on the border. And when you actually see the images and you hear the voices of the children, that was one of the ways that the American public was able to understand the impact of the policy, and there was this backlash against it. So I think putting that human face on all the numbers, on all the rhetoric, getting behind that rhetoric and showing the reality is so critical, and it's done both through filmmaking, journalistic stories, and art.
Absolutely. And then, Veronica, you are, of course, on the policy legislative side of things, and we've been seeing some of the hurt that's come about from legislation from more conservative policies. Talk about what the work that Senator Booker has been doing on this, and really how states have been using the resources to help the undocumented.
Yeah, thank you for having me. So right now in Congress, I'm sure as you know, we are also dealing with sort of everything that this administration is throwing at us in immigration policy world. And so the declaration for the emergency at the border is sort of the latest thing from this Trump administration. And I think we're just coming off a few weeks ago a 35-day government shutdown. And the reason for that shutdown, right, was that the president did not get his way and Congress would not give him the funding to build this border wall, right? So he literally shut down the entire U.S. government, or most of it, because he didn't get that money. And so Congress has a huge role to play here. So coming up this week, actually in a few days, the U.S. Senate is going to vote on a resolution to terminate this national emergency declaration from the president. So last week, the U.S. House of Representatives voted on this, and it passed with bipartisan support. And we just found out a few days ago, actually, that we now have 4 Republican senators that will vote with us, and so it will also pass the U.S. Senate. Unfortunately, the way the National Emergencies Act, the law that regulates and allows the president to do this, the way it works is that even if it's passed in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, it still has to go to the president for a signature. Obviously, since he's the one that declared this emergency, we don't expect that he will sign it. We expect that he will veto it. And so Congress is really struggling with how to regulate and how to oversee and provide oversight for this administration, because part of it is really trying to figure out what are the actual facts, the actual data, the actual information. And the numbers that we get don't correlate and line up with what this administration has told us, right? We've now seen administration officials come to Congress and testify that, there is a surge in people crossing the border, that there is an uptick in, potentially criminal individuals that are coming towards the border. And the numbers that we have do not show that that is true at all, right? I think it was in the first 6 months of 2018, we saw CBP said only 6 people that they even flagged were potentially dangerous because of their country of origin that they apprehended at the border. We know that the numbers of apprehensions at the border are actually going down and not increasing. And so this is why I think it's really important for these films and for all of the media and journalists that are there telling the actual stories, because unfortunately what we have seen in Congress is that we cannot just trust this administration to give us factual information. Mm-hmm. And so it makes it more important than ever to have people at the border, to have these films, so that the American people actually know what is happening.
Leads perfectly into my next question, and I'm posing it to the entire panel, and it's around the importance of media. And I was thinking more from the standpoint of empathy building, particularly when you're working with narrative, where you can craft a story that will bring someone into the lives of someone that they would otherwise not be able to see, give them, a different perspective. But certainly also from the journalistic standpoint, it's the information gathering. Just can you expound on that a little bit more, and maybe speak to some anecdotal stories or, evidence that you have around people having seen a story or, seen a coverage and it having like a real impact?
Well, I guess my work outside of this is kind of, I write and work in the theatrical forum in New York City, but it tends to tour. So two examples, I guess, is the first play that I had ever written took place in a shack in South Africa. And I'd gone down there and researched it and kind of wrote it around issues that were happening there, but it was also kind of comedic and funny, and really talked about post-apartheid now and how people that have HIV/AIDS were kind of affected with depression around that disease, and not just like the quick fix of it, right? And so that ended up running off Broadway and became a movement for UN AIDS and PEFLAR, and they brought it back down to South Africa, which started a whole movement around depression. So the ability to sit in a theater for an hour and 15 minutes kind of brought about people wanting to activate past that experience. And then the second example is so after that, the Rockefellers gave me a bunch of money to go run around the United States and go into detention centers and go and cross with migrants on the border, and then sit in on countless immigration hearings in New York City and interview judges around the country. And so I've written kind of a play about that system. And we just recently had a reading of it, which people were moved by this one scene because they didn't understand that women, when it comes to domestic violence, women can't claim asylum for domestic violence because it happens in the US along with other places. So it's not specific to a country. And so that then, I guess Fox 5 in New York City just saw that reading and then wanted to do a whole story about that in their in local Fox 5 news. So I think that you do have the ability as a storyteller to mobilize people when you tell a good story just with good narrative, you know, and hopefully around things that can propel us as a human race forward.
So I agree. I think that when you put a face on the story and the multimedia work I do, I write, but I also am a contributor for PBS NewsHour. And one of the stories that really attracted a lot of attention, it just showed a scene on the border, at the border fence. First of all, explain to people away from the border that we do have a fence, a barrier, a wall, steel slats, whatever you want to call it. There are big stretches of border where we do have that barrier. But there is an event that happens in El Paso and Ciudad Juarez. It's called Hugs Not Walls. And this is where families, much like the families you saw in that short film, are given the chance, but in this case, not just to meet at the border, but to actually embrace. And they're given about 3 minutes. And so we've got hundreds of families from both sides coming from the interior of the U.S. up through Mexico from other parts and getting a chance to see their loved ones. So we picked one family, one young woman who had a new baby, and she was trying to meet with her family from Mexico. And the other side, the family also had a new baby. So there were these two little cousins, and they were getting to greet each other for the first time. And, you know, so the mic, we planned it, had mic'd her up, but these were all natural moments and just gave people the feeling that they were there in the middle of these hugs and getting a real sense of the emotion behind just having a few minutes with your loved ones. So nothing really replaces putting that experience before the public so they can see it and feel it and be part of it, as opposed to just, you know, saying 100 people gathered at the border and they all gave each other hugs. So putting that real experience that you're talking about in your theater performances really is powerful.
Yeah, and again, I think I want to emphasize how important it is for us in Congress as lawmakers to actually hear these stories. And one of the worst examples, right, was the two children from Guatemala who died in CBP custody last year, right? It really wasn't until that story broke on the news that any of us in Washington, D.C., that knew what had happened, right? So again, I think this goes back to this administration not giving us full information. And to highlight that point, the administrator of CBP was testifying before Congress on the in-between time. So one of the children died in early December, another one in late December, and about in the mid-December, the CBP administrator was testifying before Congress, and he didn't even mention this death at all. And I think, for us, it's really like these stories, when we hear them, it allows, politicians, my boss, to go to the border to try to see for themselves. But even oftentimes, they're not allowed into these facilities. So it's really key for folks, that are doing these art pieces, that are doing these investigative pieces, for all of the young people that are out there, that are activists, that are going to the border and highlighting really what is happening. Honestly, that is how we are getting our information, and how the only way that we can try to build some legislative language around to try to restrict what this administration can and can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then speaking to being able to advance or underscore particular narratives, certainly this administration is advancing the narrative of immigrants being against American values or a threat to American values, when of course, if we look at the history of this country, right, what was our founding but people who came from other places to make life better for themselves? Yes, but also to improve this country. And I'd love for you to talk about how immigration reform, first of all, speak to specifically some of the legislation that is being forwarded on reform, but how that actually really undergirds and underlines true American values, if we look at our history.
Right, and I think, this is really important because what we're seeing is what I think from Washington, D.C., right, is sort of a smoke and mirrors from this administration, right? It is really this racist narrative that immigrants are bad, but not all immigrants are bad, right? It is really people of color, it's Latinos, and that's who they're attacking, right? And so we saw this leading up to the last election cycle where the weeks prior to the election, all you saw was, right, President Trump talking about the caravan. They're marching towards America. They're going to invade America, right? And so that was his way of sort of telling people, right, don't pay attention what's happening in North Korea or what's happening in Russia or what's happening in any other part of this administration. It's focused on something that's not even an issue, right? And so in Congress, what we've tried to do is, thankfully, we sort of have a divided Congress now, and so Democrats control the House of Representatives. So what they're working on and what they'll actually introduce this coming week is a sort of comprehensive immigration reform bill. So it would be complete DREAM Act, the full DREAM Act. There'll be a pathway to citizenship. We'll restore TPS protections. I think another important point is that because we're talking about the border wall, we're talking about national emergency because it's sort of just the latest thing that this administration has done. But I think it's been 2 years of an attack and changing our immigration policies. That's not just the border wall, right? It's the zero tolerance policies that led to the family separations. It's changing internal memos at the Department of Justice and at DHS. It's taking away TPS, temporary protected status, for people only from certain countries, which again feeds into this sort of racist narrative. So there's a host of immigration policies, right, that this administration has done. And so this bill that will be introduced in the House, unfortunately, right, fortunately it will pass the House at some point in the next coming months, but unfortunately when it comes to the Senate, because the Republicans still control the Senate, I think we've already heard from them that they have no interest in dealing with that piece of legislation. And in fact, I'm sure they will try to work on their own, which probably will not have a path to citizenship. But I think there is a small amount of hope there, right? In 2013, Leader Schumer, along with what we called the Gang of Eight at the time in Congress, were able to pass a comprehensive immigration reform bill that got 68 votes in the Senate, which means there were a handful of Republicans that voted for this. And then it went to the House of Representatives, which was controlled by Republicans at the time, and it sort of died. They didn't even bring it up. And so part of me thinks that there is hope that with a democratically controlled House that will pass this comprehensive bill, maybe we can get back to in the Senate a more bipartisan product and then try to compromise on what that final thing is. So that's sort of what Congress is working on.
That's where we're at right now. Yeah, that's...
Yeah, I would just add, there has been so much talk about immigration reform, and as journalists, we really have to hold all lawmakers accountable because unless, as you said, it's a bipartisan effort, it's not going to happen. And what we do know from polls, no matter what people's views of all these divisive issues, the wall or whatever, is almost everyone agrees that the current system's broken. Yeah. And they're clamoring for some sort of action, so it's hopeful to hear that things are starting to move forward.
I mean, I remember I actually read the bill in 2013, the whole thing.
17 pages.
Yes, I did. I was
bedtime reading.
I did. I actually read it because it was like a thing I had to do at the time. But is it changed? Is it changed a lot, or is it the similar bill?
Well, so in the Senate, we would say that we should start with that bill because it had bipartisan support. In the House, it'll be different.
So I just wanted to kind of bring it back to your referral to the emergency situation and kind of like emphasis, air quotes, right? You didn't make them, but I could hear them. And I think that when most people think about the emergency at the border, it's the child separation from their families that's been going on. I just wonder what you're seeing in terms of states' responses to, I know it's not in their jurisdiction directly, but, to the extent that kids are being removed out of the Homeland Security jurisdiction, or are there more reunifications going on? Like, what are you seeing around that story?
Well, fortunately, the overall policy of separating every parent and child has gone away because of the outcry. There are still some separations, but it's not a blanket policy. But there is still a need to reunite some of those separated parents and kids. Some of those parents were deported without their children. And there are a lot of children who came up on their own to be reunited with parents or other relatives who are stuck in, they're not detention centers, but they're Health and Human Services shelters, which, professionals have said that is no place for children to be. The big thing we're seeing now are thousands of migrant families from Central America, what they're calling the Northern Triangle area, coming up asking for asylum, parents with very young children. The big need is actually, it doesn't sound as, build the wall is the big champ, but what they really need are more, hire more immigration judges, hire more people who can process the claims to move it up, because people are waiting 3 to 5 years in limbo, and that backlog is, in a way, encourages more people to come up and try their luck, because of course they're hopeful and they want a better life. So that is the problem. The immigration court system is really a disaster.
And we're not hearing much about addressing that at all.
Right, and on the emergency declaration, so there are 16 states that have filed suit against this declaration. And so I think that has been a path for states, right, is against this administration. And honestly, it seems like with the termination resolution in Congress, it'll be vetoed by the president. So it seems like the legal path will be the next best hope to try to stop what this administration's doing.
And some governors have started to pull back their National Guard, saying that they don't view it as a crisis. One is the newly elected governor of New Mexico. She was the first to say, we need our National Guard members doing other things, not standing at the border watching over a situation that really, in her view, is not an emergency.
So the tide is turning a bit. Yeah. All right, I would love to open it up to some questions from the audience. Yes, gentlemen in the front, please speak up so we can hear above the...
Okay, I'm Oscar de Esa from Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. I'm visiting Austin right now. And I've got a question for the journalists and representatives of Congress. Has anybody thought of looking at the main point that triggered off the situation of the president becoming hatred towards putting boundaries coming into the United States, specifically for Mexican and Latin individuals? Have you looked into the cause of it? Why does he have that much anger in him? Has anyone researched on that?
I think as most things with this administration, we've found it really hard to try to understand why he does anything, honestly. I think this president is sort of hard to gauge. I will say on sort of a similar note, part of the legislation and something we've talked about is we don't need to be spending money on a wall. We don't need to be giving DHS or ICE more money without any restrictions or with oversight. What we should do is look at what's causing all of these folks to want to come from Central America, right? And a lot of that is the history of U.S. policies in Latin America.
That's as far as the people coming in. But my question directly to the journalist is picking up on the brain of the individual that's causing all these problems. Why does he have that hatred?
But it's hard, as she was saying, to get inside someone's brain. But what I can tell you, the facts are immigration from Mexico is at an all-time low. And there are not, it has plummeted to there are so few people coming, and there are actually more people going back to Mexico. So that's not the idea of shutting down immigration from Mexico. There really isn't a need for it. What we have now is more of a humanitarian issue with families, and that has to be addressed. And the wall will not solve that problem. People are actually coming right now up to the wall, peeking in, and the fence and the wall is not actually on the border. It's away from the border because they need to do maintenance on it and all of that. So we have hundreds of people right there saying they're not sneaking in. They're turning themselves in. So there are real questions about why a wall, why now, what will it actually do?
I'm just going to give 2 examples. Look into the president's past as far as the investment that he made in
Thank you. Yes. Yes, you. Thank you.
So my question is for the two storytellers here. What would you say the relationship between the privilege you have as storytellers to the stories you tell, for especially when they deal with people that probably don't have as much access to storytelling capabilities, such as filmmaking or media outlets as you do, and how does that privilege does it get addressed in your work and how?
Question about privilege for storytelling, for giving voice to different stories, and if that's addressed in your work, and if so, how?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I come from a culture that systemically has had access. So I've kind of had to make access for myself. And so I give myself permission maybe in a way that others might not. And my permission comes from the fact that I'm just a human being and that I can empathize and understand. But when I am writing for a culture that is not inherently mine, because I'm American, you know, my mom is half First Nation, but like I write for a lot, I try and put characters in my work that have also been marginalized to try and give opportunities to voices and actors that have also been marginalized. But what I have to do when I do that is I always have to bring in a person to consult with. I have to listen to my actors. I have to work with them as collaborators. I have to ask translators and friends to help not only translate just the text, but the sense as well, so that I'm also paying attention to the fact that it is not my culture, you know, and a sensitivity to that and listening and receiving more than I'm saying, this is the answer, I've got it under control. So that's kind of how I address it in my work, but I don't want to take away permission to storytellers to tell stories that are not their own, because you then take away the permission, you then have, because a lot of storytellers, it is a money game, you know, so a lot of people come from a certain economic class that can do it, and if you start taking away permission to tell other stories, then you'll only get stories from that economic class in our country. And so I hope that when they do tell stories, that they're sensitive and they listen and they receive more than they say, this is my agenda.
And I would say I feel privileged that I have the opportunity to tell these stories, and also because of my background, which maybe looking at me, people may not know. I was actually born in Mexico, and I've been raised on both sides of the border. So I think I've been able to, and I'm bilingual, bicultural, dual language, so I feel like I can serve as a bridge. That does not mean I can tell every single story, and so I really look for those people to share their experiences and to trust me to explain their situation, and not to portray them too often as either villains or victims, which tends to happen, but as just human beings, like you said, who have the same dreams, the same challenges that we all have. Having said that, we do need more young filmmakers or journalists who have a variety of backgrounds to come and tell those stories, and to make sure that we are all getting it right and having a variety of stories, and not having this perception of the other, but that of us.
I know this is not exactly answering your question, but I think this is an important point as it relates to Congress. I think when we're talking about immigration, we're talking about the southern border, oftentimes, right, it's seen as a Latino issue. And that's why I think it's really important to have representatives in Congress that understand that background and that come from some of these communities. And also, for myself, have staff in these offices that look like me and that understand these communities. Because, for example, when we were working on in 2013 the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, there were meetings that I went to with people that were writing the bill, that were finalizing the bill, and there was one Latino, myself, in the room, no one else, right? And so oftentimes we were left out of these critical decision makings, or we're left, off the table. And so I think it's not exactly your question, but I think it's an important point to make too when you're talking about Congress.
Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes.
What kind of things can we do as individuals to help bills such as the ones you were working on Congress to help get them more movement for the future?
What can be done to support bills to help get more movement in the future towards progression of immigration issues?
Yeah, I actually think we have a really good example, a successful example. If you look at 2017, when Congress flipped and Donald Trump became president of the United States, you had Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and immediately they said, we are going to repeal Obamacare, right? We're going to get rid of health care reform. And everyone thought it was a done deal. We're like, they control everything, they have the presidency. And really what happened, or why that didn't happen, was because of people, just everyday people in America that stood up and said, no, you are not going to take away my health care. What are you going to replace it with? You don't have an idea to replace it with something. And so it was individual people that called their members, that showed up sometimes to their houses, sometimes to their offices, that protested in the street, that held rallies. And then it was all over the media and the news, right? And people picked it up, and that was like, for a year, over a year and a half. And what happened was we were able to get enough Republicans, because they had all of that pressure from their own constituents, to say no and vote against it, and it didn't happen. And I think that that can be a model for immigration reform, right? You need enough people in these states and their own constituents to tell them, right? And so this is where comprehensive immigration reform, where we thought we were going to be successful, because it wasn't just the dreamers. It wasn't just young people that were undocumented that were standing up. It was businesses that were like, hey, these people are important employers. It was the agriculture industry that said, these are our employees, right? So you had multiple facets of society that were coming together to say immigration reform is important for all of us, for our country. And so we need that now, while this humanitarian crisis is happening at the border. You need people and constituents to tell their elected officials, like, this is unacceptable. We cannot keep giving ICE money or DHS money and without any accountability, or also telling them we need comprehensive immigration reform that has a pathway to citizenship, or whatever else that you think should be in the legislation.
Use your voice. Is that our last question? Anyone else? Going once, going twice? All right, I want to thank our wonderful panel. Thank you all so much for joining us. Angela Kocherga, Joey Martinson, and Veronica Duran. Thank you all. Thank you guys for joining us. Please come back tomorrow morning when we will have a screening at 11 a.m., Brady. We would love to have you join us again. Thank you.